Chapter 12. The Elder. Sedonai breathed deeply from his cliffside eyrie. The massive nest was generations old and clung to the cliff with river mud and magic. The river paraded through the Dragon Gorge in a flow of color and sound. The bright red ginkgo leaves floated atop the swirling peaks of crushed turquoise and lapis lazuli. Generous mounds of purple foam bobbed up and down along the edges of the confluence. All the way down the gorge, a rose-colored mist hovered in the air. The cliffs mounted vertically up from the rushing water. The air sung with the arrival and departure of the dragons. Gold, red, blue, orange, and every color of the spectrum was found among the clan. The colors only deepened and became more vibrant as the dragon aged. The brilliant green of Sedonai glimmered in the sun. His attention was inward, traveling the silky terrain of his intuition. He was thinking of Ladrin, who had yet to come home from delivering the creature to the mouth of the great river. Mara had returned quickly, and although Ladrin had further to go, he was fast and should have been home by now. Sedonai peered up the river. Dragons flew in and out of the gorge, but there was still no sign of the deep blue initiate. The elder heaved a sigh as his intuition affirmed that Ladrin had not yet begun his journey home. What was the dragon up to? He had been a devoted student, but often seemed to follow the teachings too literally. Sedonai regretted that there had not yet been an opportunity to speak to Ladrin of his phoenix. He realized that the young dragon should not have been in the wilds of Gren Amar with an unknown creature. According to tradition, he should have been in his nest, receiving nourishment from the other dragons. A dragon that had integrated the fire and had completed the flight through the sky was supposed to keep to the nest and remain away from the council for 30 days. It gave the dragon time to simmer and fully come into balance. There was no way to prepare a dragon for the phoenix, and so each was left to make the discovery alone. But perhaps, Sedonai mused, it had been too much for a dragon like Ladrin. The mysterious and the taught were meant to occupy a dragon's heart equally. Now the elder wondered if Ladrin had swung too far into the mystery. With all that Ladrin had done so far, he just might bring the mystery crashing down on them all. Chapter 13. Belderon. Belderon dozed in the half-light of the cave. He lay tucked in the furs on the sisal mats, rolled over the stone floor. He had slept all through the day and all through the night. It was deeper than sleep. It was a trance. His body had long since received the rest it required, but something in his soul was still lingering in the dream time. The mountain kept still for its guest. Its massive stone body was taken with its own new music, the multiple tones that hummed heartily throughout. It seemed as though the mountain had brought a lullaby for Belderon to sleep, or perhaps it was comforting the lost mountain man, reminding him of his faraway home and sending a feeling of belonging deep into his soul. Whatever it was, Belderon slept from dawn till dawn, only waking when the sun surged into the shelter and crashed like a wave over the young man's face. When he first opened his eyes, he did not remember where he was. He looked around at the dark stone and then out to the entrance of the cave, lit up with morning light. He sat up and looked for Thervius. In his beloved's absence, he remembered everything, waking up in the grove, his crying, the falling icicles, and then his journey along the trail of snow orchids. It had led him to the talus of granite and rose quartz, and then to this cave. Everything was quiet. The silence sealed him in, alone, and completely lost to anything and anyone he'd ever known. Belderon walked out to the entrance of the cave and sat down among the rocks. He stared at the snow, the evergreens in the distance, and the pair of mountain peaks beyond. He wondered at the inspiration that had led him out of the grove and into the night. Now his mind leapt into a great white abyss. What was he supposed to do next? In his mountainous homeland, it was always clear. His people lived at the edge of their survival, and there was hardly any time to rest. Even when food was plentiful, there were still buildings to repair or trails to cut. A person finished one task with a clear and impending mandate of what needed to be done next. He had felt helpless and lost in the grove. Now he again was at a loss, but the feeling now remained as a quiet but emotionless question in his mind. Snow had long covered the tracks of their journey into the night when the cave flooded with water, but his keen sense of direction recalled their path, and he stood up and began to retrace their steps in the bare daylight. Perhaps it would lead him to his companion, or at least a clue. At midday he came to a stretch of earth where the snow was shallow. The new snow had fallen on bare earth, not the thick pack that lay all around. He dug down with his boot and found frozen, upturned soil. Belderon stopped and looked around. He noticed hazy burn scars on the bark of the nearby trees. His mind raced. He could not recall what had happened here. Had they been bewitched? He scrambled for a solution until his head hurt. Belderon closed his eyes and tried again to hear the mountain. Perhaps it would help him. The mountain at home always did, but nothing had changed. Belderon couldn't hear anything but the sound of his own breathing. When he opened his eyes, he noticed a patch of snow orchids nearby. With no direction to follow, he realized he had time to take a longer look. He walked over and lay belly down on the snow with his face up to a bloom. He had never seen anything so beautiful. The white petals were pearly and smooth. When he looked closer, he realized the petals were slightly translucent, with a flickering glints of the palest blue and softest pink within. It was exquisite, delicate, and yet sturdy at the same time. These flowers grew abundantly in this harsh environment, with its fierce winds and incessant storms, and yet they never compromised their beauty. Belderon's face softened. "It has courage," he whispered to himself. It flowered regardless of the dark moods of this mysterious world. He recalled the sweet light they gave off on his nighttime walk. His heart dislodged from its worry and spilled over in gratitude. Belderon stood up and once again let the romance of this austere but mystical environment flood him. There was nothing to do now but return to the cave. Strangely, though, this knowledge was floating in the peace of his grateful heart. He looked down at the snow orchids and decided he should pick one to give Thervius if he ever found him. But he changed his mind. If he severed the flower from the ground, the light would no doubt fade quickly and the bloom would expire shortly after. Instead, he stood a moment longer, taking them in so he would not forget. Their beauty surged through him more strongly, as if they were thanking him for his choice. At last, he turned around and began his walk back to the cave. A deep blue evening fell over him as stars emerged to light the way. Belderon found the mouth of his cave and sat down at the entrance in the starlight. He missed Thervius. They had already spent many evenings like this talking and laughing under the night sky. Thervius was so excited by everything, juggling multiple topics and asking lots of questions, some of which he knew the answer to and some he didn't. Belderon loved sharing his knowledge, and he felt that Thervius loved listening. He adored watching Thervius explore all the ideas that spilled him into new realizations. Everything was so big to him, so wonderful and important. Being with Thervius was like swimming in a mountain stream in the summer. He was invigorating and playful, always dancing in new ways over the same round thoughts. The sensation of being with Thervius washed over him now, and he smiled. If he couldn't have his companion, He could at least have this feeling. Belderon let it expand within him and would not let it go away. He recalled the orchids and their brave blooms. Their beauty washed through into the love burning within Belderon. Now all that existed within him was his gratitude to the flowers and his love for Thervius. Everything else drained away. They were two bright points within him, and he let them burn and burn till he was warm to the bone. Hours passed, and Belderon didn't move. He was within, between the orchids and Thervius. Suddenly, from between the two feelings, Belderon began to hear music. It was a subtle, soft hum followed by a lower, harmonic note. Belderon sat stunned. Nothing in the environment had changed, but now this mysterious music flooded him with subtle waves. It was beautiful, peaceful, and it felt like it was coming up through the rock that supported his weight. He started to hear it from the rocks around him, and then he heard it coming from the cave behind. As he realized all this, more notes were added with every rock issuing forth its 2 or 3 alternating tones. The effect of all the sounds together was an ethereal symphony. In this music, nothing was amiss. All was well, exactly as it should be, and Belderon's mind did not fight it. There seemed no point to it any more. It had long surrendered to the fact that he didn't know what to do about his predicament. The only act worth doing now was taking this precious music in. Belderon remained entranced, on his stone, hour after hour, listening all through the night. The sounds were simple, but the combination of them never repeated. Belderon felt like he could listen forever. He had never heard anything like it, not even the beautiful songs of Thervius compared. Belderon let it flow through him and up into the early morning light. The sun rose. It flared up into the sky and over Belderon sitting at the mouth of the cave. At that same moment, Belderon heard a voice. He blinked in amazement. It was more than a voice. It was a song. Its pitch was high, but neither male nor female. It was singing a phrase and then pausing as the music continued endlessly. Then it would sing the phrase again. Belderon held his breath, bringing his body to utter silence so he could make out the words. The morning light intensified over him as one by one the words released their meaning. The second Belderon grasped the full message, he collapsed to the ground, turned around, and threw his arms around the stone that had supported him all night. It was a message, a clue. He laid his head on it and let the voice waft through every part of him as tears filled his eyes. He intended to stay as long as the voice remained. It was the least he could offer in return. In that way, with his ear to the stone, Belderon fell into a deep sleep with the words, "To the river and way up high," being sung over and over through his mind. Chapter 14. Aftermath. "We are bereft," Marcus began. "We lie in the desolate wake of a great evil. It has destroyed many of our homes. It has destroyed the front of our longhouse. We can rebuild these, but now we grieve for what we cannot fix. We have lost Helga, our beloved storyteller." The dim air was filled with muffled sobs. Marcus sought out each person with his eyes. "We have much work to do, but first we say farewell to the one that brought us the stories of our ancestors." The chieftain stood before the covered body of an ancient woman laid upon the making of a pyre. The storyteller had known for a year that it would soon be time to die, but the days continued to pass with the same rhythm and upward momentum. But when she lay huddled next to her people in the longhouse, heard the roof ripped off, and looked up into the face of a demon, it was then she realized she no longer wanted to live, and it was in that same moment that she took her last breath. When the demon mysteriously drifted away, nobody moved. Everyone lay in shock. the weight of the trauma pinning them to the floor. Finally, Marcus felt the mountain relax and knew that the evil had left. He stood up, and immediately the wailing began. They grieved for their storyteller, for their homes and longhouse, and for their eyes that had now seen a demon and beheld the most destructive rage. Night started to fall. Marcus and some of the other villagers began gathering up debris to build a fire that would ward off the cold of the night and hopefully some of the chill in their hearts. At the foot of the fire, some people slept, some sobbed quietly into their arms, and others stared blankly into the flames. Marcus went from person to person, taking stock of each one's welfare. Then he walked out and surveyed the damage. He learned which families had lost their cabins and how many beams had been ripped from the longhouse. In the morning, he gathered everyone together and relayed a plan where the homeless families would quarter with those who still had homes. As some standing cabins were already full with large families, the rest would stay in the unharmed end of the longhouse. The builders would throw up a makeshift wall at the damaged end until they could formally rebuild in the spring. For now, their main goal would be to survive the winter. Their stores were minimal, but with the help of the hunters, they would make it to spring. But first it was time to say goodbye to Helga. The people gathered around the body, and Marcus took all of them in. He wanted to reach in and erase this nightmare from their memories. They were haunted now. They could easily rebuild their homes in the longhouse, but how to rebuild their spirits, he did not know. Marcus recounted the gifts that Helga had so generously shared with her people. He urged them to recall the stories now to comfort them in this dim time. In them, he said, they would remember how good can overcome evil and how people always return to joy after hard times. The people stared at him helplessly, and he realized that they were going to need something stronger than stories. He recalled how the young traveler, Thervius, had told them of oracles and magic from his homeland. The chieftain wondered, maybe help could be found there, and it was to the south. The demon had come from the south. Perhaps these people had released the black magic. Now 2 questions burned into Marcus' mind. Could this land of magic offer any solace to his people? And was it this magic that was to blame for their suffering? Marcus concluded the farewell to Helga, and the pyre was lit. Then the chieftain dispatched some to prepare food for the day's meal, and others to tend the fire. The rest he told to take stock of their homes or repair to the sound end of the longhouse if they had no shelter. Finally he called his assistant to him. "Do you know the stories?" Marcus asked. "I think so," Elwyn replied. "Start telling them," Marcus commanded. "If you forget, make something up. I need to go south to learn about this evil. You are in charge. Keep them preparing for the winter, and every night tell them a story." "I will," said Elwyn. He hid his anxiety about Marcus' departure behind a dutiful nod. "Thank you," said Marcus. He turned to prepare for his journey. The next morning, the chieftain announced his plans to the village. The people stood before him with pale faces and dark circles under their eyes. They breathed reluctantly. Their bodies were alive, but their souls strained at the effort to live. Marcus hid his despair of them under a string of commands. Then he explained that if this dark possession could not be helped, then the future was grim and promised only a slow descent into nothingness. What he didn't say was that he felt it was only a very short time before their souls slipped away into total hopelessness. He looked into their fearful eyes and told them to stay in their good memories. This is how it would be again in the future. They would rebuild, they would be happy, and eventually this would all be a vague shadow in their minds. They loved their leader and nodded to show their respect. But hope they could not offer, and some steeled themselves against an impending sense of abandonment. I will return as soon as I can, Marcus reassured. I will find out where this demon came from and ensure that it never happens again. The people were quiet. Do not forget our children and our children's children, he said. We must rebuild for their sake. We must keep ourselves well for them. It will be well again. I promise. Then Marcus turned from the wounded longhouse and walked past the embers of the fire through the wasteland of cabins and dead foliage. Moving into the direct path of the demon sent chills down his spine. He swallowed hard. Everything was dead. The leaves, the nearby trees, a lone bird or insect on the ground. He felt the sadness of the mountain. It was the grief of something beautiful now undone. Marcus paled. He had never encountered a situation he could not fix. Nothing had, as of yet, defeated his body or his spirit. He struggled to believe he could do something now. Surely, beyond all this desiccation, there was a remedy. He didn't believe in a world that didn't have an immediate answer to every problem. And to him, there were really only two problems, cold and hunger, and both of those offered a clear path of action. But now a problem worse than death had arrived. He had to find an answer, and as of yet, it was nowhere to be found. The chieftain stared ahead at the endless path of death and decay. Somewhere at the end of this, there had to be something that would help his people live again, something to reassure them. He felt the mountain tighten the way it did when a storm was coming. Good, he thought. That's what we need, a rain that will wash all this evil away.